Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another of NCNW's Women's Empowerment webinars. Tonight, we indeed have a very special guest who has joined us. She is an expert. We'll introduce her more formally in just a moment. But before we get started, I'd like to ask our communications director, Mr. Kevin Johannes, to give us some tips on how to use the GoToWebinar platform.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. If you are on a computer, you will see you have a menu to the right, starting with an orange block and an arrow. Below there, you will see a section that has questions. We ask that you type in your questions, and we will ask them at the end of the program. I ask you to be succinct with your statements and focus on the questions mainly. Also, you will be able to receive and see this on our NCNW website in a few days under the programming section. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at ncnw_HQ@ncnw.org.
Thank you, Mr. Johannes. And again, welcome to NCNW's Women's Economic Empowerment Series. We meet every fourth Thursday evening at 7 p.m. for these webinars, which we hope that you find instructive and helpful. I want to thank everyone who participated in NCNW's 59th National Convention. For such a time as this, seeking resilience and resurgence, it was very successful thanks to your participation. As we all know, and you need no reminder, we're less than 2 weeks away from the end of the general election for 2020. I say the end because millions and millions, tens of millions of Americans have already voted. And I hope that you have already established a plan and are well underway in implementing a plan to cast your own ballot, but just as importantly, to encourage your friends, neighbors, family, co-workers, and contacts to do the same. This is an important election, and tonight our topic bears on the importance of it. Often you hear people make the distinction between politics and economics. But really, there is no distinction because each system depends on the other. And we have a noted expert to help guide us through that conversation tonight. What do we expect economically from the outcome of the election? And then, what bearing does the economic condition have on the way Americans will vote? Dr. Julianne Malveaux is known across the country as an outspoken progressive. She has long been recognized for her insightful observations. She is trained as a labor economist at the famed MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, noted author of several books, and political commentator. Dr. Malveaux has been described by none other than Cornel West as the most iconoclastic public intellectual in the country. Her contributions to the public dialogue on issues such as race, culture, gender, and the economic impact of all of that are shaping public opinion in the 21st century here in America. Soon she will be coming out with a series on the wealth gap in connection with the University of the District of Columbia. Dr. Malveaux's popular writing has appeared in USA Today, Black Issues in Higher Education, Ms. Magazine, Essence Magazine, and The Progressive. Her columns appear regularly in Sisters Magazine, our very own in-house journal, as well as the LA Times, the Charlotte Observer, the Detroit Free Press, and other media outlets. No doubt you have seen her because she is often a guest on CNN, BET, PBS, Roland Martin, MSNBC, and other networks. We're delighted to have her as our guest tonight for one reason, among many. During her time as the 15th president of Bennett College for Women, Dr. Malveaux was the architect of exciting and innovative transformation at America's oldest historically Black college for women. Under her leadership, the administration identified 4 key focus areas: women's leadership, entrepreneurship, excellence in communications, and global awareness. Dr. Malveaux is president of Push Excel and was the co-chair of Delta Sigma Theta Social Action Commission. it gives me joy and pleasure to introduce Dr. Julianne Malveaux. Good evening, Dr. J.
Good evening, Janice, and thank you so very much for that warm introduction, as well as for the opportunity to share with my sisters about what's going on with the economy and politics. I mean, economics and politics are twins. Both of them basically determine who gets what, when, where, and why. Econ does it basically through the numbers. Politics does it through the legislation, but we're both after the same thing. So the question for my sisters gathered this evening is, what kind of economy will you vote for? See, I know you're going to vote because you're NCNW members. And I cannot imagine daughters of Mary McLeod Bethune not voting. But we also want you to be excited about voting and to understand that you have choices. Next slide, please. This is my favorite quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. He said, "I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits." Now, what self-centered men have torn down, and we could say women too, other-centered, back, although I can read it, other-centered men have can still build up. I believe that one day mankind will bow before the altars of God and be crowned triumphant over war, bloodshed, and nonviolent redemptive goodwill to proclaim the rule of the land. Now, this is one of my favorite King quotes. It is really those first 2 sentences. I have the audacity. What does audacity mean? It means the nerve. It means the temerity. It means it's something that you hadn't thought about before, but now you get to think about it. What kind of economy do we want? I have the audacity to believe that people can eat, that people can learn, that people can be cultured, that they can have dignity. That's what Dr. King asked for, and that's what we all say when we do our little "We Shall Overcome" and we sing and we sway on King's Day. This is what we say we believe in, but do we really? You know, next slide. That you have to ask yourself, next slide, please, is do you want an economy that supports people or corporations? Question mark. We had tax cuts in 2017. The bulk of those cuts went to corporations. The corporate tax rate went down from 39% to 32%. Corporations were saving money. But people at the bottom, they got a little bitty break, a couple $100 for a couple of years. And now they're back to where they were, almost. Do you want an economy that is self-centered or other-centered? Other-centered would mean that people who call themselves Christian could not tolerate people going without food. That people who call themselves Christian would want everybody to have health care. That people who call themselves Christian would cringe at the notion that anybody would be hungry, would be unemployed, would have to live in the streets. And yet we see this every day. Next slide. Do you want an economy that has a wealthy pay their fair share, or do you want other people to pay their share? The top 10% of our population owns 87%, listen to me, 87% of the stock value in this country. Top 10% owns 87%. Now, most Americans don't have stocks, don't. Many who do have it in a mutual fund or a retirement account, I'm not mad at you, but here's the point. When we measure the positivity of the economy on the stock market, we're really saying the rest of us don't count. The 87%, the 10% who have 87% are more important than the rest of us. And as we know, the current administration placed great stock, if you will, on the stock market. They talk about it all the time. As we see millions of people who are hungry, unemployed, and all that, I've made the best economy we've ever seen. First of all, not the truth, but secondly, as I said, when you measure by the stock market, you're measuring the minority, not the majority. So we want to know if the economy will have wealthy pay their fair share, or, next slide, an economy that extracts surplus value from people at the middle and at the bottom. And at this point in time, the middle and the bottom are almost indistinguishable. About 60% of all Americans are under the middle or the bottom. The minimum wage has not been increased in more than 10 years. It's $7.25 an hour. It's less than $15,000 a year. If you work full-time on the minimum wage, you're working below the poverty line. But we have millions of Americans who do it. Now, many say, well, I'm not that worried about the minimum wage. Hey, if you can't find anything else, you're going to be working the minimum wage. You're going to be trying to figure out what to do and how to do, and it really does become very challenging. Next slide, please. In the middle of, we have a pandemic going on, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but the question, we'll ask you these questions is, do you want an economy that protects people in the middle of a pandemic or that ignores people in the middle of a pandemic? We had the CARES Act passed, and I'll talk about that again a little later, but that passed, but nothing else has passed. That's number one. But number two, we know that people have lost jobs. We lost 40% of our Black-owned businesses. 40% of our Black-owned businesses, I think it's a little more by now, like maybe 44. We lost a huge number of Black-owned businesses. The restaurant industry has flattened because people don't want to eat out. People who eat out are more likely to get corona than people who do not. So I have developed a culinary skill in these past few months. But in any case, these are the kind of questions that we have to ask. And then we have to put it in the political context. Next slide, please. So the political context of what candidates at the federal, state, and local levels have policies that bring us closer to King's dream. Now I'm going to tell you up front, nobody's perfect. Nobody's going to do everything that Dr. King said about having the audacity to believe. But if they get us closer to that utopian economy where everybody is valued, then that's who deserves support. NCNW deserves people, lifts up Black women. So you have to look at candidates, who lifts up Black women? Who make it easier for the poor, for the left out, for the young people who aren't going to school? These are the questions that we have to ask. Which candidates at every level? The national election has given people are talking about, there's a debate tonight, the national election, but guess what? There's state and local elections, there are other elections that are equally important. Who will candidates appoint rather to be key positions in the cabinet, the court, and other positions? Now, we're going through a nomination. Well, it's not even a battle. It's not even a battle. Amy Coney Barrett will be on the Supreme Court unless something happens. But we know what that means. And it means things around economic issues as well, because the court often rules on issues of taxation. The court often rules on issues of corporate behavior, on issues of monopoly. And when you have monopolies, you have people who are able to basically charge you anything. And so basically the Federal Trade Commission and others are supposed to do anti-monopoly work, but they don't always do it. And it depends on who's on the court, who's in the Justice Department. Right now, there's a case going on, which is really interesting, where the Justice Department wants to break up Facebook, Google, Twitter, and one more, the high-tech companies, because they say they're too big, it's too much monopoly power, and it leaves the people at the periphery. But we've seen this time and time again. We saw it in 1912. I didn't see it then, I wasn't there, but we saw it in 1912. We've seen it over and over again in terms of the issue of corporate organization. The courts have something to do with that. So next slide, please. Who will make economic policy? Who will be driving that? Usually, often the president is the driver, but his or her appointees are the ones who essentially implement. So first issue, next slide, is the Federal Reserve Bank. The governors of the Federal Reserve Bank basically set interest rates. Interest rates right now are almost zero. I mean, it's 0.25%. And Jerome Powell, who's the head of the Fed, has said he expects it to be that low until 2022. That lets you know that basically what he's saying is our economy will not fully recover until 2022. That's a very challenging thing for us to grapple with, but there it is. There has never been a Black woman on the Federal Reserve. Let me repeat that. There has never been a Black woman on the Federal Reserve. There are many women who are qualified, many sisters who are qualified, but none has ever been chosen. Perhaps this will be something for Brother Biden to do, or or someone else who notices the deficit in Black women's representation on a policy group like the Fed. The other places where you see economic policy made, the Department of Labor and Commerce, but also HUD. All of these departments have something to do with the economy. Our esteemed Honorable Alexis Herman was the first Black woman to lead the Department of Labor. There has not been one since then. She was appointed by President Clinton. She, of course, did an amazing job, as she does, especially around women's issues, around mothers, essentially attempting to make public policy more flexible. And this is what we need. I mean, you can't pass a law for everything. Sometimes you have executive orders. Sometimes you have what the secretary wants to do and tells you to do. So the Department of Commerce basically deals with business. The Department of Commerce, the Minority Business Development Agency is under the Department of Commerce. They provide money for small businesses, minority businesses, basically to survive and thrive. The Department of Commerce has many other roles, in depending on the leadership, they may develop relationships with other countries and take groups of business people to accompany them, or groups of civil rights leaders or others. The Department of Commerce is very important. Housing and urban development is also very important. And I'm going to get to that a little later when I talk about evictions. But I want to talk about it as well because it really does talk about, there are a bunch of policies that basically deal with how you have access to housing. And we have currently a Secretary of HUD who doesn't get, he first made headlines by buying a $30,000 table for his office. And then, I mean, and, you know, I'm not going to go there because it would be marginally liable. It's not really. But in any case, let me simply say that the issue of housing, as we've seen gentrification in our communities, as we've seen more and more homelessness, even as we experience economic expansion, housing belongs under here. Now, the one that I often get really disturbed about is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This bureau was established by President Obama, structured by Senator Elizabeth Warren, who essentially looked at the ways that consumers could be exploited, from predatory loans, payday lending. There's a whole range of things. And what the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau does is it regulates these things. It has the power to fine companies who violate the rules or who attempt to exploit people. Under President Obama, the Bureau was really just getting its legs, but it had several significant lawsuits. The next administration chose to attempt to essentially neuter the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Their first thing was to say that they wanted to change its name. Then they said they couldn't sue anymore. Now, these are all executive orders from the office of the president. There was a great guy who was in charge, Richard Corday. He resigned to run for governor of, I think, Ohio. And in any case, a political appointee got it and basically said, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to do anything. And so the only protection in a capitalist economy, we have so-called free markets. They're not really free. They're so-called free. But regulation reels people in. So technically, people could charge anything for anything. And we've seen this with insulin as an example in the market. When people just say, okay, people want it. They're desperate for it. I'll charge them this ridiculous sum of money. Regulation is what basically reels the forces of capitalism in. But what we've seen in the past 3 years is that the forces of capital are just like running. They're running. They're doing their thing. And we are much at the detriment. So let me step back for a moment and just raise the question. So where is our economy? I'll take the next slide, please. So where are we? What is the economic status right now? Well, the first thing that we must know is that COVID had a horrible impact on our economy. We basically lost 30-some million jobs. We GDP, gross domestic product, plunged by about 30%. It's back up now, but just a little bit. Remember, somebody said they were going to have the best GDP growth ever. It was going to be over 4%. Well, since 2017, it's never been over 4%. And what we know now is that it is quite low. We're in a recession. The only way you can slice it is that we're in a recession. And as I said earlier, with the Fed's projection, we're not likely to get back until 2022. In 2019, we had GDP growth of 2.3%. That's okay. I mean, Obama did that and better. But as I said, in the second quarter of 2020, a 32% drop in our GDP. Now, the second really important issue is state and local economic growth. State and local governments basically depend on a series of things, some from the federal government. They depend on their tax base. Cities depend on their tax base, property taxes, all of that. States depend on their tax base and the income tax base. Most states have both a federal tax and a state tax. But in the middle of a pandemic, people are strapped. And if I don't have income, the District of Columbia doesn't get my taxes. And so when you look at it that way, we see state and local governments being squeezed. Now, what's the problem there? Well, there are many, many problems. But one of them is that Black people, and Black women especially, are more likely than anyone else to work for state and local governments. So when the state and local governments are being fiscally squeezed, what happens? People get laid off. Now, people are already being laid off because of COVID, but now you have people in the Department of Social Services, in the city hospitals, in schools, who are being laid off. All of this hasn't shaken out yet, but there are those on the Hill, Nancy Pelosi in particular, who very much want the federal government to help state and local governments. And then you have others, Mitch McConnell in particular, who doesn't want to do anything for cities and states. Their attitude is that cities and states were failing anyway, which is not true. Cities and states are failing anyway, so why should they bail them out? Well, that's not a tenable argument, and as a matter of fact, it's a very objectionable argument. But that is an argument that they've used to prevent basically the federal government from helping state and local governments. So we have to pay attention to that because people are getting laid off. And when people get laid off in the middle of COVID, we're also going to see a reduction in services. Now, this is a time when people need services more than ever. Social workers, nurses, teachers, garbage workers, public transit. All these things are on the cutting block unless the feds can give some help to state and local governments. Moving on, next slide. So then I want to talk about the employment situation, which we're all so very familiar with. The unemployment rate is down now. It's to 7.9%. It was 8.4% in August. The last rate we got was September, and that was 7.9%. It's a downward trend, but a couple of things are happening. Number one, people are dropping out of the labor market. So people are not working or looking for work. It takes money to look for work. It takes effort to look for work. So a lot of people just like, I'm not looking for work anymore. They need the work, but they've gone to I don't know how many places and got no to the no. So the Black unemployment rate is 12.1% for men, 12.6% for Black women. That's 1 in 8 people. And as I said, the participation rate is dropping, not by a lot, but by a percentage point, and a percentage point is significant. So people are working, people are coming back to work slowly in some places, but not in all places. And again, of course, COVID has a big role to play in this. People who don't feel secure are not going to work. I know so many people who are 65 and over who've just decided to retire. If you ask them a year ago, they plan to be a principal, a professor for the next 5 years. And now they're saying, I'm out of here, it's too risky. So the employment situation could use help. One of the things that could happen that would be helpful would be supplemental unemployment payments, which we did for the first 6 months of COVID, but there's no appetite or little appetite to do it now. Now, interest rates are about the cost of money. How much does money cost? And why is that important? Because if you want to stimulate the economy, you want people to spend money. How do you get people to spend money? You make it available to them at a very low price. So as I said earlier, the interest rate is 0.25%. That's like nothing. It's less than a percentage point. It's almost like saying free money. Of course, you and I don't get free money, but the better your credit rating is, the cheaper money you'll get. Some credit cards are still charging 24.5%, and people who have bad credit can't do any better than that. But in terms of other things, some people who have good credit can do very, very well. And the interest rate is an indicator of how we want to grow the economy. So low interest rates for people with good credit are intended to stimulate spending. This is a time people say buy a new house, buy a new car, basically because it's pumping money into the economy. On the other hand, new house, new car, evictions and foreclosures. 6 million families are behind in their rent or mortgage as of the 1st of September. The Centers for Disease Control has asked that there be a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, but many of their several apartment associations that are suing, they want to take this to the Supreme Court, which is why the Supreme Court matters. They want to take this to the Supreme Court because they believe that having a foreclosure or eviction moratorium interferes with their property rights. Okay? So again, what kind of economy are you voting for? So we have 8 million, let's see, what is it? Corona put 8 more million people into poverty in September. And all of these people are basically housing insecure. But we can't just talk about housing insecurity. We can actually talk about food insecurity. Dr. King said he had the audacity to believe that people everywhere could have 3 meals a day for their bodies. We have millions who do not. We have more food insecurity in this country than we've ever had, almost ever, not ever. I don't want to start extrapolating like other people do, but that we ever have before. We have, I'm trying to find my number here. Where's my food number? It's roughly 54 million. It's 54 million people are hungry, and 18 million of them are children. Are children. So we need to pay attention to that. Yeah, 54 million, 18 million children. Before Corona, it was 35 million people who were hungry. We don't call it hunger. You know, academics have ways of stating things. We call it food insecurity. And what we know is that many people who are poor have more month than money. Their money tends to run out about the 24th of the month. And then they've got, or 25th or 23rd, but then they've got to figure out how to make it for the rest of the month. We have lots of people who aren't making it. Our food banks are very overtaxed. The number of people who are living on the streets has increased, and our tolerance for them seems to have decreased. So we basically are in a situation where a lot of people are being stretched. Even those who are not being stretched may be feeling some fear and anxiety because some people don't know how long they're going to keep their jobs. People have been laid off. People have been put on furlough, put on part-time. Even those who have very secure jobs worry about the burdens on their families. Is there someone else in the family who's not employed, a sibling, a spouse, a child? And what is the impact on that? Now, the last thing in this situation is the issue of student loan debt. There is $1.8 trillion. No, it's $1.8 trillion that's owed by young people for student loans. 1.8 trillion. That's more than credit card debt. It's more than mortgage debt. It is more than, it's just about more than any kind of debt you can think of. These students are paying anywhere from, they're paying up to 12%, depending on where they got it from. If they got it from the feds and they're in grad school, it's about 6.8%. Undergrads, about 3.4%. Private lenders, you don't know. Some young people go to private lenders when they can't get enough federal funding. And we also know when we talk about education that this has not been an education-friendly administration. Indeed, when I talked about the secretaries, the cabinet members that we should be concerned about, the education is one of those situations that we should be concerned about. Education funding has gone down by 20% in this administration. We have a Secretary of Education who's tone deaf about any number of issues. HBCUs have been thrown a bone, and we've often, very few presidents basically just turn their back on HBCUs. It's a good talking point. However, that's not enough. If you give the money to the college, but you don't give the financial aid to the students, what are we to do? So that's that. Let me see the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. The other thing to talk about is infrastructure. In 2016, we were promised infrastructure. Our country is physically falling apart. The American Society of Civil Engineers consistently grades us between a C- and a D on any number of public structures. Our bridges, a D. Our waterways, a D. There are a couple of places where we get B grade, but certain people are promised infrastructure improvement. It has not happened. Why is the infrastructure so important? Because it spends money. If you've driven your car down certain highways at certain times, you worry about your wheels. I do anyway. But in any case, infrastructure, if you smooth those roads up, what are you doing? You're creating some jobs. You're creating some jobs, you're putting money into the economy. This is an easy get. It's a bipartisan easy get. Why haven't we heard anything about it? And so when we say, where is our economy? Our economy is in a recession. The employment situation is not good. Interest rates are extremely low. Evictions and foreclosures are up. Student loan debt is up. And we have an infrastructure that's failing. This is what FDR did and and Eisenhower did. When economic times were hard, they put people to work. Federal FDR with the Works Progress Administration, hiring unemployed people to do everything from collect slave narratives to work in libraries. Eisenhower is the architect of our federal highway system. And again, basically putting people to work. Now, I would say that both of these kind of systems tend to favor men over women, and that's another story. We can talk about that. But let's also say that money is going into the economy. So now I've told you where we are. Then the next question is, what do we do about it? Next slide, please. Well, the first thing we do, we've got legislation that could help us. And that legislation is being held up. The CARES Act passed in March. It put about around two and a half or so trillion dollars into the economy. It made a difference for lots of people who didn't have to default on their mortgages or fail to pay their rent. It helped restaurants and others who were going to close because they didn't have customers. The Paycheck Protection Act was part of the CARES Act, and it basically made it possible for millions of people, tens of millions of people, actually to get supplemental paychecks. It has run out as of September. Now, the HEROES Act is another piece of legislation that's sitting in Congress now. Nancy Pelosi has been negotiating daily, literally daily, with Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, about this act. What the act would provide is, what it stands for is Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act. It will provide a second stimulus check. It will provide dollars for school reopening. It would provide, as I said, desperately needed stimulus, and it might provide some more jobs. The Democratic bill, which was passed in May by 200 plus Democrats in Congress, had a provision for $3 trillion. Mitch McConnell, who of course controls the Senate, refuses to take that to a vote. So Pelosi and Mnuchin are negotiating what they can do, what they can agree on. They probably have come to agreement, but for one thing. Mitch McConnell wants a legislation that if you get corona on the job, you can't sue. So now we know that employers are supposed to make you safe. But McConnell is saying if you get corona on the job, you cannot sue. And Pelosi opposes that. Most people oppose that. Most Democratic senators certainly oppose that. But it's not a partisan issue. It makes sense. I mean, when I remember when corona first started, not when it first started, maybe about a month in, my postman came by and he didn't have a mask on. And I said, dude, what's up? He said they ran out at the post office. They ran out. So blessedly, I have friends who brought me some disposable masks. I gave him a couple and I said, that's just unacceptable. But you have people who were working who didn't have the protection equipment that they needed. And so the HEROES Act will provide both stimulus and also some social correction and economic correction. But again, we'll have to see what happens because we live in a time, the question I asked you at the beginning, what kind of economy are you voting for? So that's a question for you and it's a question for each and every one of us. What do we want out of our economy? I would say that Dr. King had it right. 3 meals a day, education and culture, peace and freedom. But we won't get those things unless we vote for them. Last slide, please. And the last slide just says vote. Not only vote, but vote like your life depends on it. Vote like your life depends on it. Vote like it's the most exciting thing you did, because guess what? It is. We're taking our economy back. We want an economy that responds to people. We don't want hungry children or children in cages. We don't want to spend such a large amount on our national defense, which I call national offense. We want to have a balanced budget, balance in terms of human needs and other needs. And so that's the charge, sisters. Can you do this? Will you do this? And I'm available for questions. But I see Attorney Mathis is back.
Well, I didn't actually go anywhere except virtually. I enjoyed that very much, Dr. Malvo. So much information packed into such a compact presentation. It was truly fascinating. We've got, looks like about 60 or so people, and I know many of them have questions, but I was jotting down my questions as we went along. And I wanted to ask you, you hear this word stimulus. I was watching one of the television networks today, and the stock market was going down. It was kind of drifting downwards. And then Nancy Pelosi made a statement about the possibility of a stimulus bill passing, and the market started to trend back up as soon as she made that statement. What is a stimulus, and why does the stock market care about it? And why is the stock market seemingly stable or on the upswing when so many people are unemployed?
The stock market, first of all, it's partially gambling. Literally, it's partially gambling. People are looking ahead to see what this stock is going to do. What do you think is going to happen with it? As an example, Moderna stock, the company that's supposed to be getting the coronavirus antidote, whatever, the vaccination, their stock went up when people heard that they were in the running. So part of the stock market is simply gambling. The other part of it is investing in something you think is going to work. And then the other part of it is the basic health of the economy. So if a stimulus package occurs, that means money goes into the economy. That means people spend money. That means the economic outlook is better. It's better. But sometimes when the stock market may look good, but as you said, a lot of people are not feeling so good or don't have those benefits because the stock market is not an exact measure. As I said earlier in the conversation, 87% of stock belong to 10% of the people. Most of us don't have stock. So it's really almost prejudicial to use the stock market as an indicator of economic health because there are other indicators of economic health. Why not look at poverty? Why not look at, again, unemployment? There are a number of other things we can look at besides the stock market.
Okay. Once upon a time, most jobs came with pensions, especially if it was public work, something called a defined benefit plan. Those are just about, you don't hear much about defined benefit plans. Instead, we have 401ks. What's the difference and why does it matter to Black women?
Okay, fewer than a third of all workers have pensions now. 20 years ago, it probably would have been closer to, or maybe 30 years ago, closer to half. But pensions are, it's your retirement. And basically your employer is promising you with a pension plan so many dollars per month or per year or for whatever for your retirement. You retire and you get a pension. A 401k is an investment like in the stock market. It's not a defined benefit. It's a whatever happens to the stock market benefit. So it's really interesting because let's say that you and I, same age, but I choose to retire while the market is in a slump. And you wait and retire when the market is going back up. You're gonna have a few more $100s a month than me. So you know what sisters need to do is know what their benefits are, maximize the use of them. One thing that's very important is that many employers, although you don't have a pension, will match your savings in your 401k. And I don't know how many people don't take advantage of that. You know, some employers, if you save 5%, they'll match your 5%. Do it. Just do it. What we're learning is that, you know, as we get older, we're just more financially insecure, and we have to prepare for that.
You mentioned that the minimum wage hadn't gone up in, I think, over a decade or about a decade. And sometimes you hear people argue, say, well, if you raise the minimum wage, we'll just hire fewer people if we have to pay them more. What do you think about that? Is that true or false? Is that just propaganda, or what do you think?
Well, there have been several studies by economists about this, especially looking at contiguous, for example, looking at Massachusetts and New Hampshire, who are right next door to each other. So Massachusetts raised their minimum wage. And I must note that several states and some cities have a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum. Seattle's minimum wage is $15 an hour. I think in Washington, D.C., it may be $9.25. So several states, I think about 20 states and several cities have higher minimum wages. But in any case, the study of two contiguous states showed that when Massachusetts raised its minimum wage, they didn't lose jobs. And what people thought, so they did not lose jobs. On the other hand, we saw a very small decrease in employment in Seattle, about a 2 to 3% decrease at places that were paying the minimum wage, like your coffee shops or those kind of places. So you did see a slight decrease. We do have to pay attention to that. But I think that, you know, when employers pay people low wages, we're subsidizing those employers. What do I mean? If you earn the minimum wage, you qualify for food stamps. You may qualify for some other form of public assistance. That's tax money. Why not just pay you what you're worth, as opposed to all of us having to basically make up the difference between what the employer did not pay you?
You know, there is, it's been well documented that COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting Black folk and people of color and lower income people who don't have the option to work at home. I know that you testified before the Congress about reparations. And generally, we think of reparations as repair for damage done during slavery or during Jim Crow. But what about the notion that maybe there might be some repair that needs to be done to these communities of color that have been so devastated by COVID-19?
You know, we in the reparations community want to be very clear and careful about use of the term reparations. So there's reparations and there's good public policy. It's good public policy to repair these communities because of COVID. I would not consider that reparations, but I would consider good public policy. And lots of good public policy should disproportionately benefit Black people. This is something that our nation is afraid of grappling with. But there are many cases to be made for repair around COVID. What has happened to Black people, women, Black children, Black public servants, the garbage worker, the bus driver. You know, I know you saw the one about the bus driver in Detroit where the lady deliberately spat on him, and next thing you know, the man died from COVID. Now, that would have been another story. But anyway, we're not going to go there. What I'm saying is that we know the damage has been done, and it's been willful damage. And it's a function of every way that our communities have been ignored over time. So yes, I see repair, but like I said, I wouldn't necessarily see it as reparations. But while I'm on that point, Janice, I did not mention, and I don't know why I didn't because I had a page for it. Oh well. I did not mention health, and that was a huge omission in my conversation because health care represents 1/7 of our GDP. One out of every $7 is spent on some form of health care. Thanks to President Obama and the Affordable Care Act, we have very few people who don't have access to health care. Now, some can't afford it, but very few have no access. Now we have an administration that would like to make healthcare more difficult. And when if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. If you don't have your health, you can't work. You can't do anything. And so the whole issue of health is when we have to prioritize. October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and we know that with African American women, we're getting breast cancer as early as age 35. We get it when we're younger than white women. We're more likely to get it, and we die from it quicker. And all of those things are things that we need to pay attention to, and all too often we don't. So I just want to lift up the issue of health. As I said, I had a page, but whatever. But just keep it in mind as you talk about the economy, because healthcare is a vital part of our economy. Now we can, and this COVID is going to kick us because they're talking about vaccinations, all that. Who's going to pay for it? People are talking about these vaccinations may cost as much as $125. Well, that might not be a burden for some people, but it will be a burden for many. The average Black family earns about $40,000 a year. What if you have 3 kids? You, your spouse, 3 kids. That's $650, $750. That's a lot of money. So just saying.
If you want to go ahead and say more about healthcare, I'm sure that the audience would appreciate it. And meanwhile, we'll check to see if we've got questions from the audience. If you've got questions, Mr. Johannes, or should they put them in the chat? How are we doing the questions tonight?
Yes, ma'am. They should just type it in the question box, and it's forward down on the display. We do have one question. It was, do large companies still offer profit sharing to their employees?
Some do.
Profit.
Yeah. The question was, do large companies offer profit sharing? Some do, and newer startups and others are more likely to do so than established companies, but some do. It's not, it's much less across the board than it used to be. The labor market is shifting, and in shifting, workers are the losers. Unless you're in the tech area, there's not a lot of wiggle room. People are afraid to quit their jobs because they want to keep their health care. Well, so your health care should not be tied to your job. Your health care should be tied to your health care. You should have access to health care whether you have a job or not. But having done that, you have people who are stuck. They won't leave their job because they know they have a pre-existing condition or something or something or something. So, but no, the profit sharing thing happens. Google does it. Microsoft does it. But a lot of folks don't do it.
What do you think of companies that are, of this administration's effort to still, after all these years, trying to outlaw the Affordable Care Act? Well, look on your
I just think it's horrible.
Well,
I think that healthcare is a human right. And I think we lose people's lives because of lack of healthcare. There have been several studies that talk about how many people die, Janice, because they don't have healthcare. We've had cases where people had abscessed tooth, they didn't go get it fixed, and then they died because of the infection. We've had cases where women chose not to go get a mammogram because they couldn't afford it, and then their breast metastasized. I'm not a physician and I don't play one on TV, but what I do know is that health is a very important part of our well-being, of our personhood. And the fact that this administration has spent, again, I earlier said infrastructure. They haven't spent any time dealing with infrastructure at all. They have not spent any time dealing with a number of other issues that they promised to deal with, but they have spent plenty time trying to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, which is absurd.
Okay, are there any other questions from the audience?
Yes, ma'am. What are some of the ways to support Black businesses more than we do now?
I think you have to be mindful about supporting Black business. We don't have the communities that we used to have where in the hood you knew you would find the barbershop, the barbecue place, the hairdresser, and all the our businesses. Now we're far more dispersed, and so it has to be much more mindful. There's a book, Maggie Anderson has a book out called A Year of Buying Black, where she and her husband and their two girls decided that for a year they were going to spend all their money on Black-owned businesses. It was an interesting, funny, and challenging. The book you crack up at some places where she talks about quality of service. Some parts where she talks about looking for undies that are manufactured by Black people. Um, but basically, you have to be mindful. You have to say, I am going to do this because I want to support my people.
I noticed that
You don't
radio,
have
TV,
to go online. You can go online and do it.
Radio One has a feature on one of their radio stations where they list Black businesses. They'll give you 4 or 5 every week and encourage people to patronize those businesses for that week. And some of them, restaurants, dry cleaners. And I thought that was sort of an interesting concept. You mentioned that most presidents pay attention to HBCUs regardless of party. Can you assess whether the commitment is equal regardless of party affiliation? And what is that about? Is it the advocacy of the alumni? Is it the taking pressure off predominantly white institutions? What is it about HBCUs that allows them to get funding no matter who's in power?
I think it's really, education is an easy thing to support. There's so many things that our community needs and wants that will not be supported. The reparations conversation is an interesting conversation. We're having it finally now, but yeah, I bet you there are millions who don't, probably half of all Americans don't support reparations. You start talking about minority business set-asides. Some people support them, some don't. But education is an easy sell. And I think that's why Republicans have often, the Bushes are notable examples, have embraced, education, the United Negro College Fund, HBCUs. I don't think Elizabeth Dole at one point was a great supporter under Dr. Cole of Bennett College. Bob Dole led one of our fundraising campaigns. Like I said, I think education is an easy sell. It's not controversial. Nobody's going to come out of their mouth and say, I want these Black people to be ignorant, even that's what they're thinking. I don't know that, but just extrapolating. But they're not going to say that. But so education is an easy sell. It's an easier sell than so many other things. Urban development, those are not easy sells.
I have an unproven theory that it also has something to do with the colors, the teams, the affinity that we hold, the esteem that we hold HBCUs in. You got loyal adherents who will fly into the Hill or write their members of Congress. If we were organized around healthcare the way we are organized around HBCUs, we might see different results. We are organized around it. You get my point? People know the anti-pride colors are blue and gold. People know the HU, There's a lobby for that. Right? There's a lobby for it. There is no lobby for the Affordable Care Act among Black folk. There's no lobby for defined pension benefits. Or when we go up there and raise and saying about it, it's mostly a handful of misfits complaining to whoever will listen. Just a thought. Just thinking out loud.
I do think that we are not as organized around many issues as we are, excuse me. That's what I get for drinking my soda fast. But we're not organized around many issues as we are for HBCUs. And so I think, it's a page to take out of the book. We have 3 lobby organizations for HBCUs. We have UNCF, we have Thurgood Marshall, and we have
NAFIO,
yes. So we've got 3 organizations that are they're not always on the same page, which I think sometimes is problematic. But you've got 3 organizations pushing for HBCUs. As you say, who's pushing for defined pensions or for health care, those kind of things. I think one of the great things that is emerging is the voice of Reverend William Barber and the extent to which, with his Poor People's Campaign, he's lifted up a series of economic issues. Now, he can't stay, he's not going to be the lobby for health care or defined pensions, but he has been a lobby and a force for economic justice. And he has basically galvanized people. They're going to do something, I think, the Monday before the election. He's galvanized people essentially to stand up and fight.
And he will be at Howard University at the chapel, I think it's this Sunday, for kicking off a week of activity leading up to the final day of the election. Mr. Johannes, do we have other questions from the audience or comments? Not just questions, but comments.
Yes, ma'am, we do. First question is, how should we support, or what do you think about supporting Black-owned banks?
Well, there's a mixed theory there, but I'll tell you, I'm a great supporter of Black-owned banks. I am struggling through a book on Black money, and my second chapter is on Black-owned banks, and I talk about Maggie Lena Walker, who was the first Black woman to charter a bank in Richmond, Virginia in 1903. And that bank actually was the longest tenured Black bank. It lasted for over 100 years. It closed and it was reorganized, but somebody bought it in 2005. Once upon a time, we had over 100 Black-owned banks. Now we have 23. Why do we have over 100? Because white folks wouldn't let us come to their banks, wouldn't lend us money. And so we started our own. And that's a model, starting your own. Go open up the door and get it yourself. So when you look at that time period and our banks, what we know is that there was resentment to the fact that we could get our own. And between public policy, regulation, and economic shifts, we basically lost many of our banks. So as I said, now we have 23. I wish we had more, but here's the other piece of this. Banks are supposed to be profit-making institutions. Banks are supposed to make money, which means now they don't have to make a lot of money, but they have to make some, which means that Pookie and them cannot go to the bank and ask for a loan in the name of Blackness. I mean, Pookie has to have a balance sheet too. How are you going to pay it back? And many of our banks have gotten in trouble because with a sense of community, we've lent to unsound borrowers. And that is one of the things that happened with Maggie Lena's bank. They had a beautiful history. And then for early 21st century, some people who were community people, well-meaning, but didn't have the money to pay the loan back. And the Federal Reserve, the federal FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, they audit banks. And if you have bad loans, they may take your charter away from you. So so it's a push and pull. There are those who say, Black banks have to be profitable and sound institutions, and many are. Industrial Bank here in Washington, D.C., sound institution. And we have others. And then we have some that are skating. But yes, I'm supportive of them, but they have.
How do Black banks benefit Black communities? Or how can they?
When they can, well, first of all, we know that there's discrimination in banking, or at least we can demonstrate there has been, maybe until very recently, but many people say it's still there. So Doyle Mitchell is a model for responsible Black banking. He is the president and CEO of Industrial Bank. His uncle started the bank, and his father was president before him. And what he's talked about is the fact that they were able to lend money to qualified borrowers who come from Bank of America or Wells Fargo. So to the extent that a Black bank is willing to work with you, that is a benefit. They say that Maggie Lena was singularly responsible for the development of the Black middle class in Richmond. because that's where people got their home loans, where the other people would lend them. Now today, I mean, you can get a home loan at Wells Fargo or Bank of America or Industrial or someplace else. You have choices. But the other thing that Doyle does with his bank that some of the other banks do, but not with the cultural sensitivity, financial literacy. The whole financial literacy piece, Industrial does some things with. So I think that they're a benefit, but I don't think that they're the be all and end all. We would be poorer without them. We would be poor. When Emma Chappelle was the bank that she had in Philadelphia, United Bank of Philadelphia, and she was treasurer of Reverend Jackson's campaign in 1984. She was able to do some things to be helpful. In fact, she was responsible for me getting my home. I didn't have the 20%, I had 15. And I was trying to find the other 5. I was going to beg, borrow, or steal it. And I called her one day just in a panic. I said, I don't want to lose this house. And she said, well, what do you need? I said, well, I've got 15% and I need the other 5%. She said, let me just take the whole loan. So she took the loan. Now she sold it. That's what you do. You get a loan. But that she is responsible for me being in this house. And I thank God for her every day. And that's what banks like to do.
One anecdote out of Atlanta, the Ebenezer Church, the new building that was built to supplement and replace the old Ebenezer Church.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember how many $1 million it was, maybe 10 or $15 million, but 2 or 3 of the black banks from outside of Atlanta, in Atlanta, Citizen Trust in Atlanta, formed a consortium with a couple of other banks because none of them could lend enough money to build Ebenezer, but together they could. And together they were able to put together a package that built that institution. So it's individual homes, but it's also community institutions that get funded that you may not get a mainstream. You have to look at it carefully. Mr. Johannes, how are we doing with questions? Do we have other questions or comments with Dr. Malveaux? She's just a treasure trove of information. Let's pick her brain while we got her.
There's one more. There's a record of degreed Black women today. However, we are still the lowest paid in wages. Many have insurmountable student debt. What are your suggestions?
Is that a question or is there more to it?
Can you suggest some ways in fixing this problem?
Student loan debt.
Well, I always have a plan B. I mean, student loan debt is crippling for everyone, but it's more crippling for African Americans and others. It's really crippling. You have, when I was at Bennett, I remember often going through the financial aid records just as a matter of curiosity to see young people who had $40,000, $50,000 worth of debt. And they were education majors. And I'm like, you're not going to get a job in education that's going to pay you enough to pay this back. So I think before you get there, you got to be really careful. But once you're there and you owe it, just keep up your payments. If you need to, try to renegotiate. There are some provisions in the HEROES Act that will suspend student loan repayment for a period of time, not a long period, but a period of time. And so that's something to pay attention to. But no, the student loan debt issue is huge because it's causing people to basically delay their adulthood. You have some people who are living at home because they have too much student loan debt. Can't buy a house, too much student loan debt. Don't want to get married, too much student loan debt. So basically, people postponing making adult decisions. And it's a public policy issue more than anything else. We've made it easy for young people to get all this debt. And it's an economic issue in terms of the loan cap. So what we need to really talk about is how some of this can be forgiven. And I know Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, we're talking about that. Let's see if we can get a new administration to talk about that as well.
Well, Dr. Malveaux, we want to thank you for your insights and for spending your valuable time with NCNW. We want to remind folks to visit our website at ncnw.org. You'll see there video replays of our webinar sessions. They're also stored at our YouTube channel on YouTube, ncnw.org. And we'll be back again in a couple of weeks with another installment of these webinars. And we hope that you've enjoyed them. We hope that you will consider joining the National Council of Negro Women, where our mission is to advocate and empower for you and our communities. I want to thank Mr. Johannes for.
I was gonna say thank you for the opportunity. You know, I'm a life member of NCNW. I love NCNW, and I don't deal with sections anymore, but I do love NCNW.
Well, we appreciate you.
And encourage everyone to support it.
There will be a Julianne Malveaux column coming out in Sisters Magazine next week, so be on the lookout for that. It'll be in your email box. And if you don't get email from NCNW, that may mean that you want to renew your membership. Membership is only $50 a year at the basic level, and we invite all to join us as members of NCNW so we can keep bringing you this kind of programming free of charge. Thank you all, and good night. Thanks, Dr. Malveaux.
Good night. Thank you.